Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. I hope you're all doing well, and it's a change of season, as we all know, and you probably realise I've had a cold and I'm getting better every single day, but just keep yourselves very warm because at the change of season we're all susceptible to getting colds and flu, so make sure you look after yourself. So before we get started, we're going to continue on part 2 of our story. But first of all, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's continue with part 2 of our story tonight. Fern studied Miss Weaver rather cynically. Did she really believe her own spin? Was it possible to bring back a corpse from the dead? She did not think so. Would it not be a whole lot better to bulldoze this entire house and start all over again? That's what most sane, rational people would do. As if Miss Weaver were reading her thoughts, she said, "This is the only house in the street made from bricks and mortar, Mrs. Estelle. That's a big deal, you know. The original owner built this place from scratch himself. It's solidly built. The house boasts many charming features that are not easily to discern due to all the burgeoning creepers that are sprawling across the walls. It rather reminds me when I was a little girl. My father returned from a garage sale with the ugliest porcelain doll I'd ever seen. He gave it to me as a gift for my birthday. You know what I did, Mrs. Estelle? I burst into tears. I was so upset. I couldn't believe my father had brought me such a grotesquely ugly doll. He told me the doll was special and was incredibly old, that it was an antique, and that my mother would fix it up for me and make it beautiful again. I was so grievously upset because I wanted a brand new doll, like all my friends at school. I'm not proud to admit I went to my bedroom and cried and cried. I thought it was so unfair that I'd been given such an ugly antique doll. A couple of days later, my mother presented me with the doll my father had brought me from this garage sale. It was barely recognizable, Mrs. Estelle. There are no words to describe how beautiful the doll was. It quite literally took my breath away. I couldn't believe it was mine. My mother had cleaned it up, washed it, fixed its hair. She'd got an artist to fix up the face again, and got a friend of hers, a woman called Mary, to make the doll some stunning clothes. I'm telling you, Mrs. Estelle, it was a stunning doll. I'd never seen a doll like this before. All the girls in my year were so jealous of me, as my doll was so much better than anybody else's. And you couldn't buy a doll brand new like that. My father had seen the potential in the doll that everybody else failed to see. I still have that very special doll today, Mrs. Estelle. I treasure it greatly. Many antique dealers have offered me sizable amounts of money to part with it, but that's never going to happen. It's a stunning collector's piece. What I'm trying to say to you, Mrs. Estelle, is I think Fairfield House is brimming with the same kind of potential. I know it's impossible to see now, but your husband rather reminds me of my father. He can see what this house will one day become. I would put money on it that this will be the most superb house in the entire close, with a few nips and tucks here and there. "We will see about that, shall we?" said Fern rather defiantly, taking Larkin's hand in hers. Miss Weaver could see that although Mrs. Estelle looked fiercely resistant in her dogged determination to dislike Fairfield House, that her salient words had somehow managed to make a small crack in the foundation of this woman's veneer. And if some sunlight could filter through those air holes, Mrs. Estelle might just have an epiphany. Maybe there was hope with a potential sale after all, but she'd keep her fingers tightly crossed on this one. People, after all, could be so capriciously difficult at the very best of times, especially when it came to buying houses. "Come with me," she said. "Let me show you around the house. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised, Mrs. Estelle. This house boasts some unique features. The stone fireplace is absolutely huge, and there's some wood-panelled walls in the library that really are something to behold. I will tell you, though, everything is caked with dust, so bear that in mind." She guided the young couple down the very overgrown footpath. "Please mind your step," she warned. "Some of these weeds have got thorns on them. I've had my hands shredded by them a couple of times." Fern thought Fairfield House looked as bleak, sorrowful and depressing on the inside as it was on the outside. It had about as much blooming potential as turning a decrepit old woman into a movie star. It wasn't going to happen. In the end, Larkin had artfully persuaded Fern to let him put in an offer on the place. Fern was not remotely happy about this, but Miss Weaver's story about her old porcelain doll, being remarkably transformed against very unlikely odds, had contributed significantly in helping her to change her mind. She did of course agree that Fairfield House had very good bones and boasted some interesting features, but unlike Larkin, Fern could not envisage the house would look good even after a makeover. She just couldn't see it. As a consequence, nothing prepared her for the end result after the builders had fixed up the place, when her husband had driven them to their new address. "So what do you think of Fairfield House now?" he asked her proudly, driving his white Lexus straight up to the front door, with an "I told you so" rather smug, self-satisfied expression on his face. Fern had been unable to believe what she was seeing with her eyes. There was no way this was the house she had seen 2 months ago. It had undergone such a stunning metamorphosis, from the Wicked Witch of the West's crumbling little shack into a princess castle. "There's no way this is the same house. It just can't be. I don't understand," she said, trembling. "Is this really the same house, Larkin? It just can't be." "Sorry to burst your bubble, love, but this is Fairfield House, the very same house that you viewed 2 months earlier. It has turned out rather marvellously. Even I have to admit to that. It's been fixed up remarkably well. And believe it or not, it was all cosmetic. It didn't require as much work as you might imagine. The builders said it was all pretty superficial. And even the gardening team made light work of the yard. They nipped it into shape very quickly." "I think I've been an absolute fool, Larkin. I really do. You saw potential in this house. A potential that I failed to see. And now I've got egg all over my face. Miss Weaver was absolutely right. This house is now the most beautiful house in the entire close. A house that stood up proud and tall among the other houses, but it seemed more dignified and elegant, as if the history of the house gave her an edge over the others. It had been painted in a pale mint green colour, with sash windows done in a white trim, and there was a deep plum-coloured front door that rarely worked, while the yard was ablaze with colourful blooms. Fern could see butterflies and bees happily frolicking from one bright colourful flower to the next, and suddenly she felt terribly excited about the promise of what the future held for both Larkin and herself. The backyards of the houses on Fern's side of the street overlooked protected public land that stretched out into sizable woodgroves of tall, lofty trees. So although everybody's backyard was relatively small in size, with the added extension of the woods, it felt as if you were living on a very large golf course. So if you didn't know any better, you might believe the land belonged to the local residents. Fern had got to know her 2 neighbours on the day she'd moved in, as people in these parts did not hang around when it came to making friends. Fern, who'd lived in Atlanta for many years, was not used to such open, sincere friendliness, as when she walked down the sidewalk of a very uptight neighbourhood where she'd lived in Atlanta. She'd be lucky if she got a nod from a stranger. Joanne Rayner from next door was the first woman she met when moving in. Joanne was in her 60s and wore bright red spectacles. She had inquiring bird-like eyes that didn't seem to miss a beat. The woman looked as if she was as sharp as a tack, and was very forthcoming, as if she always wore her heart on her sleeve. "Oh, it is so good to meet you. You must be my new neighbour," she said effusively, throwing her arms around Fern affectionately, almost as if she'd known her all her life. "I'm so glad you've finally moved in. You have no idea how good it is to see the place occupied again and restored back to its former glory. Who would have thought that was possible? The house has been empty for many long years, since the last owners just up and left without a buy or leave. They let the place descend into ruin. I couldn't believe they allowed that to happen. It was such a dreadful, dreadful pity. Finally, when they did put the place on the market, it was in such an appalling state. No one wanted to buy it. I said to my husband Eric that it was madness no one wanting to invest in the property, because it was the best house in the close at one point, when the drifters actually lived here. Let's just say the for sale sign outside has been standing outside the house for 7 long years, so it's taken quite a beating. Well, I can understand why it wasn't selling. It was quite a dreadful sight when I saw it. I couldn't believe the state it was in. I tried to dissuade my husband from buying it, but he just couldn't help himself. Well, I like the sound of your husband. He clearly is a visionary. Good on him. It is so wonderful to have the house looking like this again. It is an absolute showstopper. What else can I say? Oh, that it is, for sure. Well, you wouldn't believe it now, would you? But I can tell you the children in this close used to call your house the witch's lair. It looked so decidedly sinister. But then again, Fairfield House has been neglected for over 25 years, you know. When Miss Weaver showed you around the property, she told me she almost had a heart attack when your husband put an offer in on the place. She said she had a party at her office because she couldn't believe Fairfield House had actually sold after all this time. It's the best-looking house in the close now, is it not? I barely recognise the place any more. Oh, sorry, please mind my manners. How awfully rude of me. I haven't even introduced myself yet. My name is Joanne. And I'm Fern. Oh, it's wonderful to meet you, Fern. Really wonderful. Welcome to Fairfield Close. Everybody knows everybody around here, you'll be glad to know. It's a friendly, very inclusive community. I bought you a casserole. It's chicken and dumplings. I know how difficult it is to cook when you've just moved in, so I hope it will save you from having to do any cooking tonight. Well, I don't know what to say, Joanne. That's so kind of you, said Fern, taking the casserole and placing it on the hall table. It's only a pleasure, my dear, said Joanne. We all look out for each other around here. Now I've got so much I need to do, a long list of chores, I'm afraid, so I will love you and leave you. But I'm sure you've got unpacking you need to be doing yourself, judging by all these boxes piled up here in your entrance hall. I don't envy you on that. Just before you go, Joanne. Yes, dear. Well, you were saying the previous owners just up and left. What do you mean by that? I mean just that, dear, said Joanne, pulling a face. It was all dreadfully peculiar at the time, I hasten to say. They just buggered off without so much as a bye or leave. No one around here could understand why. We were very affronted, because people around here are very friendly, you know. So for the drifters to leave in the rude way they did, without even bothering to say farewell, was very distressing for us. Anyway, maybe they live up to their names. The drifters, maybe they drifted away, she teased. Perhaps they come from a long line of gypsies, who knows? I hasten to say they were reasonably well off. They moved to Atlanta, just left the house here completely empty. Abandoned, you could say. They didn't even bother to put it on the market, or even keep it in respectable condition. It was an asset that they just left to rot and descend into rampant decay. Some people can be very strange, you know. By all accounts, they seemed very happy in the close. Russell Drifter, now he was a very nice man, you know, very amenable. I went to him every week to get my meat. He was an excellent butcher, only the best, always gave me excellent quality cuts of meat. That man loved being a butcher. So him abandoning the butcher shop was also very strange. He just handed over the reins to his partner and disappeared from this town like a bat out of hell. I mean, who abandons their job like that? And their home, to boot. It's not normal behaviour. I gather it was the drifter's older son, Rusty, who I imagine is in his 30s by now, who actually got to put the house on the market about 7 years ago, I believe. He didn't even bother to fix the place up. So was it any wonder that nobody was biting the bait? They got no offers whatsoever, and I wasn't surprised about that at all. We couldn't believe it when the sold sign came up the other day, let me tell you. Well, 2 months ago or so. Everyone in the close was wondering who the new buyer would be. And now look at you. Here you are. Here I am, said Fern. Well, as I was saying, we're delighted to have you on the close, dear. Everyone around here is terribly friendly, and you and your husband will fit in very nicely, I'm most sure. And let's not kid, it's lovely to see Fairfield House looking so good these days. I was quite gobsmacked to see the transformation to the place. I always thought it would be better off being bulldozed, if I'm being perfectly honest. But I now see I was completely wrong about that. Don't worry, Joanne. I felt as you did when I first saw the place. I thought my husband had lost leave of his senses buying it, but he reassured me it had good bones. It turns out he was absolutely right. Well, I'm looking forward to finally meeting your husband. I must get going, love. Do enjoy the casserole. I hope it's to your liking. When you're settled in, feel free to pop around for a coffee any time. Fern thanked Joanne for her kindness and her chicken casserole. And a few minutes later, there was another visitor at her doorstep, an elderly woman who was carrying a steaming apple pie in her very veiny, somewhat arthritic hands, weathered by many age spots. Fern could not help but like the old, very dignified woman at once. She had grey, tousled, rather untamed hair, and gentle, doe-like brown eyes, but there was something so maternal about her, and yet at the same time she was so elegant, with a long swan-like neck and a straight deportment, that made Fern wonder if at one time she might have been a ballet dancer or a model. "Hello, dear. I understand from my other neighbour Joanne, your name is Fern. So welcome to the neighbourhood, or the close, Fern. I've bought you an apple pie. It's warm out of the oven. I've only just made it. My name is Mrs. Von Gard, but people always call me Amelia, and I prefer them to call me by my first name." "How very kind of you to go to so much trouble, Amelia," said Fern, taking the apple pie from the old woman. It was wrapped in a lovely towel, and was warm to the touch. She could smell delicious cinnamon and caramel, and it made her feel suddenly quite hungry. "I love apple pie. This is so kind of you, Amelia. Would you like to come inside?" she asked, surreptitiously deciding that this would be the perfect opportunity to bend this woman's ears about the drifters. Maybe Amelia would know the real reason why the family just bogged off all those years ago. It would seem she had probably lived in the close for a long time. She certainly was old enough, so what she didn't know about the close and its inhabitants was probably not worth knowing. "Well, dear, it's very kind of you to invite me in, but I rather think I'll be imposing on you," she said, her eyes dropping down to the boxes piled up haphazardly in the entrance hall, waiting to be unpacked. "Oh, don't worry about all this chaos in here. I have to tell you, it's not going to go away in a hurry, I'm afraid. I don't actually care about it. It's probably going to take more than a week to unpack all this stuff for me. If I happen to be feeling industriously inclined, that is," said Fern, following the old woman's gaze. "As far as I'm concerned, the unpacking can wait. I'm parched. How about you? Would you like a cup of tea with some of this delicious apple pie of yours? I really don't want to eat alone." "Is your husband not here?" asked the woman, looking around her, as if expecting to see Larkin crawling out of the woodwork like a termite. "No, he's not, I'm afraid. Right now my husband is in Switzerland, even as we speak. A long way from home, you could say." "Goodness gracious me! Switzerland, you say? Your husband is a long way from home, is he not? And good grief, I can't believe he's left you to manage this move all on your own. You're taking on a lot, dear. It looks like you might need some help." "You could say that I'm taking on a lot, but don't judge my husband too fiercely. He couldn't take time off work to help me, I'm afraid. It's often the way. It just can't be helped. My husband Larkin, well, he's a pilot, so there are times when I'm left on my own. So why don't you come in, Amelia? I really would appreciate the company. I'm getting sick and tired of staring at these boxes that keep reminding me they need to be unpacked, and I really don't want to go there right now. Besides, I need a break. How about you?" "Well, now you put it like that, dear, I don't see how I can refuse your kind invitation," said Amelia, eagerly stepping into the house, following Fern's lead with very little encouragement. She was probably as curious about Fern as Fern was about her. Fern enjoyed the company of older people, because they had so much life experience behind them, and Amelia, judging by her heavily lined face, had obviously lived an interesting life. "Please excuse the messy obstacle course around here," she said, guiding Amelia through a pathway of the boxes. "I can't believe your husband's a pilot. How extraordinary. It can't be easy for you, dear. When he's not around, I mean. and you have to manage on your own like this. Well, put it this way, Amelia. I'd never have chosen to willingly marry a pilot. My dad was dead set against me tying the knot with Larkin, even though he thinks Larkin is a very good man. He thought being married to a pilot might leave me feeling very isolated. But you can't help who you fall in love with, can you? Well, that's very true, dear. But your father's not wrong to be concerned about you. In his shoes, I would feel the same. It can be incredibly lonely being on your own for long periods of time. I should know, you know. My husband was in the Merchant Navy. There were many times we came so close to getting a divorce. I couldn't stand being separated from him for extensive periods of time. So our marriage did go through some rocky trials and tribulations. But I'm glad to say in the end we managed to make our marriage work. Chester was a good man, you know. I was friends with all the other wives at the time, whose husband likewise were all out at sea for long stretches, you know. We supported each other while our husbands were away. We kept each other busy as you do. Some women, I noticed, were so hard-wired to be incredibly independent and very resourceful. They didn't mind being separated from their husbands for long periods of time. Many of them said missing their husbands made them appreciate them all the more, and actually strengthened their relationships. It wasn't that way for me, I'm afraid. I battled moments of extreme loneliness, even around friends. Isn't it funny you can be in a whole room of people and still feel desperately alone? I would go home every night to an empty house, and boy did I feel it. Sadly, my better half has been gone for 8 years now, and I do miss him desperately. I can imagine. I'm so sorry, Amelia, for your loss, I mean. It can't be easy for you. Dearie me, don't be sorry for me, love. I'm not looking for any sympathy, I can assure you of that. I loved the old bugger, although he did have his infuriating moments when he drove me absolutely dilly. But the less said about that, the better. I try not to put him on a pedestal now that he's dead, because people are inclined to do that once somebody's gone. I have a friend who's turned her husband into a deceased saint, now he's no longer around. She can't seem to remember that he was less than perfect when he was alive. I know for a fact he had a fling with a couple of girls in different ports when he was in the Navy. But when I remind my friend about this, she tells me I'm talking absolute nonsense. I do remember her complaining to me about his shenanigans when he was alive. But now she has a very short memory. If she had her way, she'd have her husband canonized, and I'm not joking about that either, she chuckled. Yes, I miss my hubby, Chester, very much. But you learn to adapt, don't you? You don't really have much choice in the matter. You get on with your life. We have to learn to adapt to change. Whether we like it or not, it is the way it is. But you do get desperately lonely. But of course I get lonely. But I do my best to try and keep as busy as I can. And living here in the Close, I'm surrounded by so many friends, of which I hope you will become one. So that means a lot to me, you know. I'm sure you have noticed people around here are extremely friendly. I've certainly noticed that, Fern agreed. I've only just moved in, and 2 of you have already popped around to welcome me. That would never happen where I used to live. And where was that, love, if you don't mind my asking you? Atlanta. Well, I suppose that would make perfect sense, with your husband being a pilot, I mean. Atlanta's a reasonably nice place, but just like any city that's highly populated, people can be very aloof, you know, and caught up in their own world. Absolutely, that's how I see it. Amelia stepped into the state-of-the-art kitchen, with its cutting-edge sleek cupboards, white quartz countertops, the perfect kitchen island surrounded by several stainless steel bar stools, with comfortable leather seats, which made the kitchen look all the more sophisticated. It might have looked very stark and rather cold, if Fern hadn't added some elegant personal touches to artistically turn the modern kitchen into a warm, cosy environment, with potted plants on the windowsill, a fish tank in the centre of the kitchen, opposite the eating area, that was filled with silver dollar fish that her husband had set up. There were some vintage pieces like a pale green biscuit barrel, green toaster, KitchenAid, green oven gloves, and a bowl of green grapes and limes that gave the kitchen a homely feeling that was warmly welcoming. "Goodness gracious me! You've done a lot with this kitchen and you've only just moved in. It's very sophisticated. It's like something out of a cutting-edge designer magazine. I'm in shock at the transformation of this house. Fairfield House was always the jewel in the crown in the close, you know, until of course she descended into decline. It was such a dreadful pity," she said, tuttering sadly. "All that wretched business with the drifters. I could never understand it. But then again, to be fair, Ruth Drifter, well, she was quite a difficult woman at the best of times. I'm sure she's the reason the Drifter family left the close in a tearing hurry, never to be seen again. Let's just say it was always her way or the highway, if you know what I mean." I felt very sorry for poor old Russell. He was Ruth's husband. He managed the butcher shop in town, you know. A jolly man he was, with a face as round as a full moon, and a smile that would melt your heart like butter. Everybody really loved him around here. He'd greet you so warmly when you entered the butcher shop and ask you how you were. He never forgot a name, you know. He knew everybody very well in the close, and was friendly with everyone. Ruth, his wife, on the other hand, well, she was another kettle of fish. The very antithesis of her husband. A thorny, hard-hearted and cold woman. The type of woman that could turn milk sour. I remember she had 2 teenagers. Their names were Rusty and Kirsty. Rusty must have been about 18 years old, and Kirsty 16, when the family just abandoned this place. Rusty was the splitting image of his father. A lovely young man he was. Needless to say, Ruth Drifter didn't interact with any of the locals. I rather thought she was a bit of a snoot, had some kind of a superiority complex. Thought she was better than anybody else. Probably because that woman came from lots and lots of money. Her father made his money in oil. Ruth grew up being homeschooled by a governess. Her life was like something out of a Charles Dickens novel, and I'm not joking either. Fern had boiled the kettle and gestured for Amelia to take a seat, while she cut them both a piece of apple pie, and prepared them steamy cups of tea. "Tell me, Amelia, how long have you actually lived in this close, if you don't mind my asking?" said Fern, as she hungrily tucked into the apple pie. "This is delicious, by the way. I can really taste the cinnamon, and the apple just seems to melt into the mouth." "Well, I'm very glad you like it, dear. The secret is to caramelize the apple. It makes all the difference. Let's see, how long have I lived here? Long before you were born, I rather suspect. So I can tell you that Fairfield House looks exactly like it did in the good old days, when it was the best home in this close, and it assumed that status, well, it has now, thanks to you. To your diligence and perseverance, so to speak, in getting the whole house restored to its former glory. I must congratulate you on that. Let's just say this house has risen out of the dust, rather like the phoenix from the ashes. Most people around here never believed this place would ever sell. And look at all the cynics who believed the house should be bulldozed. And the kids around here thought it was so formidable they called it the witch's lair. Not any more, for sure." "That's kind of you to say, Amelia. I'm very pleased with how the house has turned out." "Well, never was a truer word spoken, dear. Let's just say Ruth Drifter, when she lived here, everything had to be so-so, absolutely perfect. She was a pedantic woman. In those days she made absolutely sure that Fairfield House was the best-looking house in the entire close. There really were no ends to that woman's vanity and self-importance. She went around the place with a haughty arrogance, as if she thought she was better than everyone. And who says there's no such thing as class in America? The woman was forever telling us that her great-grandfather had been an English baron of some kind. We never heard the end of that. She made it perfectly clear that she came from aristocratic lineage." "How fascinating. So you say the entire Drifter family up and left one day, just like that?" "Well, I don't know, dear, what happened. But from what I gather, they did move to Atlanta. Well, those were the rumours that circulated at the time. What really happened to the Drifter family, I don't really know. And why they fled in the middle of the night, God only knows. If Russell had any sense, I hope he's left that Ruth by now. But somehow I doubt that's happened. That woman will have him under her thumb until the day he dies, I rather suspect. The man didn't have a backbone as far as Ruth was concerned. What is it that they say? A man's greatest weakness is a woman, and a woman's greatest weakness is herself. Did you get any inkling from the drifters that they were thinking of moving away? You've got to admit, it's weird. By the sounds of things, they were running away from something. And the question is, what? Running away? Said Amelia, repeating Fern's words out loud, as if they were giving her pause for thought. Now that I come to think of it, running away is a very apt description of what they did. Let's just say, my dear, it came as quite the shock to all of us when they abandoned their house and all their possessions like that. I mean, who just ups and leaves, walks away from their lives? To be fair, they did hire a removal company to pick up their stuff at a later date and sent it to a forward address in Atlanta, which is why it's believed that that is where they now reside. No one could make sense of what they did. Ruth was a rather peculiar woman, to say the very least, so I guess nothing would surprise me when it comes to that one. My late husband Eric could not understand what Russell saw in Ruth. It was a long-standing joke between the two of us. The poor old Russell, we felt he was blind when he married her. I think he genuinely loved her. But whether that woman could love anyone back is highly debatable. There was only one person she was head over heels in love with, and that I rather suspect was herself. So she wasn't attractive then, Fern chuckled. It's funny, I imagined her to be very attractive in my mind's eye, from what I'd been told. Oh, Ruth was attractive, all right. She knew it. That was part of the problem. Let's just say Ruth was a head-turner. She absolutely loved the way men looked at her, I rather suspect, with their tongues hanging out like a dog drooling over an ice cream cone. She enjoyed the attention she received. Everything about her was perfect, from her neat, trim little figure to her perfectly styled raven-coloured hair, not to mention the way she dressed. She always turned out as if she'd stepped out of a bandbox. She was classy and elegant. Men like that, don't they, in a woman? They might look at women who dress trashy, but a woman with class gets their attention every time. There was rumours that Ruth was cheating on her husband. I wouldn't be surprised if that were the case. People in the close would say, why would such a beautiful woman marry such a short, squat, well-rounded man like Russell, when she could have had the pick of the bunch? But I knew exactly why she married Russell. You do? Of course I do. She married Russell because she could control him, I rather suspect. She knew he would be putty in her hands. Other men would never have put up with a bully like Ruth. They might have been beguiled by her looks in the very beginning. But let me tell you, when they discovered what she was really like, they'd never have hung around for very long. The problem with Russell was he was such a good man. He wouldn't have said boo to a goose when it came to Ruth. I wish he'd learned to stand up for himself around her, but I don't think he ever did. I think despite everything, he genuinely loved her, although God knows why. So you think Ruth made Russell's life miserable? Is that what you're saying? Yes, I do, dear. Of course you don't really know what goes on behind people's doors, do you? You just assume you have an idea of things. And that's what I do. But I think the woman relied on her beauty to navigate her way through life to get exactly what she wanted. But on the inside, she was as cold as ice and as hard as nails. Some people around here called her the Ice Queen. Living next door, I'd often hear her raise her voice at Russell, and the things that came out of her mouth were rather demeaning. But Rusty put up with all her shenanigans, like a beaten-down dog. Poor man. So there we are, that's the end of part 2. Part 3 is tomorrow night. I look forward to you joining me then. Until next time, goodbye and good night.